Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when we last left A.P. Hill, he was arrested by General Longstreet, but the Army of Northern Virginia would soon be on the move into Northern Virginia, and they would need their hard-fighting division commander. McClellan was headed back down the peninsula, but Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had a threat to their north. Union General John Pope and his army were threatening Northern Virginia. Lee had already sent Jackson to Gordonsville to keep an eye on Pope, but with 50,000 Union soldiers, Jackson was outmatched. A.P. Hill sat at headquarters arrested, but Lee needed a dependable division commander to send to Jackson's aid. Longstreet was the ranking Major General, but he was needed around Richmond. The matter was settled. Hill would be released, and he with his 10,000-man division would join Jackson at Gordonsville. Lee sent a letter to Jackson with a directive. A.P. Hill, you will find, I think, a good officer with whom you can consult, and by advising with your division commanders as to your movements, much trouble will be saved you in arranging details as they can act more intelligently. In this impeccably courteous way, Lee was telling Jackson that Hill was a team man, but sensitive to military protocol and etiquette, and that Jackson should keep Hill and all his generals regularly informed as to what he was doing, which was against Jackson's nature. The division began departing Richmond on July 27th by rail to Gordonsville. Hill would leave 3 days later with the last of his division, with Dolly, Nettie, and Russie in tow. The war had brought husband and wife closer together. With no family in Virginia, Dolly insisted on being by her husband's side, even in the field. Despite some snide comments about her presence in the army, Dolly seemed to pay them no mind and enjoyed her time with her husband. In early August, news reached Jackson that at least 2 Federal divisions were moving toward Culpeper, so the Confederate general started moving his columns in that direction. But Jackson was quiet about any intention. Hill marched his columns as directed by Jackson, but he did not know the final destination. Captain Charles Blackford of the 2nd Virginia Cavalry asked Hill, his old friend, where they were going. Hill replied, "I suppose we will go to the top of the hill in the front of us. That is all I know." The lack of information was irritating Hill, and when the marching orders came for August 8th, Jackson ordered Richard Ewell's division to lead the advance, followed by Hill, and then Charles Winder's division would bring up the rear. However, during the night before the march, Jackson had changed his mind. Ewell would march by an alternate route to the west, but Hill was not made aware of that change. So, in the morning, Hill had his men ready before dawn, but there was no Ewell. The minutes ticked by, and Hill became agitated. He said to one of his longtime friends, "I tell you, I do not know whether we march north, south, east, or west, or whether we will march at all. General Jackson simply ordered me to have the division ready to move at dawn. I have been ready ever since, and have no further indication of his plans. That is almost all I ever know of his designs." Then columns of troops began marching past him. These weren't Ewell's men, they were Winder's. Not wanting to create a traffic jam by interrupting Winder's march, he allowed them to go by, then started his march. Jackson arrived irate and asked why Hill's division had not started to move. Hill explained himself and Stonewall rode off, still mad at the situation. Ewell and Winder collided when the roads they were marching on converged. The advance Jackson had planned was falling apart. He sent word back to Hill to reverse the course and go back to Gordonsville, which Hill did, but Jackson would claim he never gave that order. Jackson blamed Hill for the orders gone awry, and Hill would hold contempt for Jackson, knowing full well Jackson had not given the orders. The next day, Hill was to catch up to the main body of troops marching to Culpeper, but he had a longer distance to march. South of Culpeper, at Cedar Mountain, Jackson ran into a Union force under Nathaniel Banks. The 2 Confederate divisions under Jackson were thrown into battle, but were starting to give way. Even Jackson's old division was falling apart, and as one officer said, turned into a mob. Blackford was sent by Jackson to look for Hill. To his relief, he saw Hill at the head of his division. Powell had heard the sounds of battle and rushed his men forward. The light division braced the middle of the Confederate line, and the rest formed on its left, just in the nick of time. As he led his men forward, Confederate infantrymen were streaming back through his battle lines. He spied an able-bodied officer half running to the rear. Hill reined his horse and asked the man, who was he and where was he going? The man replied that he was accompanying his wounded friend to the rear. Hill bent down and ripped the officer's rank off of his collar, and looking him coldly in the eyes said, You are a pretty fellow to hold a commission deserting your colors in the presence of the enemy, and go into the rear with a man who is scarcely badly enough wounded to go himself. I reduce you to the ranks, sir, and if you do not go to the front and do your duty, I'll have you shot as soon as I can spare a file of men for the purpose." Hill's men halted and threw back the Union assaults, and when the Federals began to flee, Hill's division chased after them for miles. With the possible threat of Union reinforcements, Jackson ordered the Light Division back to the battlefield. Jackson had won a victory, to be sure, but Hill had won the battle for him. On the battlefield, Hill found a gray stallion that he would name Champ and ride him exclusively afterward. Lee and Longstreet would join Jackson, and the commanding general would formulate a plan to eliminate Pope's army. Longstreet would hold Pope in front, while Jackson marched his troops to the northwest, then curl around to strike the flank of Pope's army. According to Lee's directive, Hill was to take the lead and march at dawn. At the last moment, Jackson ordered the march to begin, in his words, "as soon as the moon shall rise." But none of his division commanders received those orders. When Jackson rode to where the divisions were to pass by, no soldiers came. Furious, Jackson rode to Hill's encampment and asked why he was not moving out. Hill replied that he hadn't received any order to move out during the night, and he hadn't. Jackson ordered the division to move, and it did. The march was hindered by rain, and this brought the march to a stop. Hill and his staff found a home to use as headquarters, as did Jackson and his staff. Next to Jackson's headquarters, Gregg's South Carolina Brigade bivouacked for the night in the rain. Jackson ordered the family's ornamental fence to not be touched or used as firewood. However, the South Carolinians used it as firewood to help dry themselves out and cook some food. The next morning, Jackson had all of Gregg's regimental colonels arrested for the act. Bad blood was brewing between Jackson and the Light Division. The next morning, Jackson found that the flimsy dam that Jubal Early's division had used to get across the Rappahannock had been consumed by the flood river from the heavy rain. Stonewall rode out into the middle of the river and sat there for an hour. Hill attempted to break the silence and rode out to him, but Jackson was so rude that Hill came back to the banks of the river without orders or instructions. Lee's plan had been foiled by a rainstorm. However, Lee would formulate a new plan. Jackson swung up the valley created by the Blue Ridge and the Bull Mountains and through Thoroughfare Gap. At that gap, Jackson held a rare council of war. After hearing from his division commanders, Jackson said he would give his decision for marching in the morning. Hill, who had always been critical of Stonewall's deep piety, turned to Ewell and said, "Well, I suppose Jackson wants time to pray over it." Jackson divided his three divisions into a three-pronged march to get in the rear of Pope's army. By the end, they had covered 54 miles in 36 hours. Jackson had effected one of the great flanking movements of the war. He was behind Pope's army and only 27 miles from the northern capital. On the other hand, Jackson had barely 24,000 men. Pope could congregate 80,000 or so Federals, and the rest of Lee's army was a good distance away. Jackson's command made it to Manassas Junction, where the men were delighted to find boxcar after boxcar full of Union Army provisions. A Virginia soldier recalled the scene. It was more than funny to see the ragged, rough, dirty fellows who had been half living on roasted corn and green apples for days, now drinking Rhine wine, eating lobster salad, potted tongue, cream biscuit, pound cake, canned fruits, and the like, the filling pockets and haversacks with ground coffee, toothbrushes, condensed milk, and silk handkerchiefs. A South Carolinian noted that fine whiskey and cigars circulated freely. Elegant lawn and linen handkerchiefs were applied to noses hitherto blown by the thumb or forefinger, and sumptuous underclothing was fitted over limbs sunburnt, sore, and vermin splotched. Jackson then moved his troops to Groveton, with Hill's division going to Centerville, the opposite direction. Word came to Stonewall that Pope was retreating to Washington, and he ordered Hill to blockade the routes to stop the enemy army. Hill got different reports that Pope was moving to Manassas Junction to attack Jackson. Hill had the correct information and disobeyed Jackson's order by coming to Groveton on part of the Manassas battlefield fought the year before. On their way there, Hill's troops stopped at a farm that had a well. They were very thirsty and began bringing up pail after pail of water to fill their stomachs and canteens. Soon the farmer came out of the house and said, "I don't think that water's very good. When the battle was fought here last summer, some dead men were thrown into it, and it has not been cleaned out since." A North Carolina soldier noted, "You can imagine that those canteens were soon emptied, and some of the men also." Hill filed into line with the rest of Jackson's divisions. The fact that Jackson did not chastise Hill for not following orders indicates that Jackson knew he had been wrong about Pope's retreat. On August 28, 1862, late in the day, a small battle at Groveton, also known as Bronner's Farm, took place between Jackson's force and a small Union contingent. Hill directed the first artillery volley that played havoc with the Union forces. It was a short but deadly engagement. It dealt a crippling blow to Jackson's high-level command. Tolliver, who had taken over from Winder, who had been killed at Cedar Mountain, was badly wounded and would not rejoin the command for a few months, and Ewell would receive a serious wound that resulted in him losing his leg. That left Hill as the only experienced division commander Jackson had. Stonewall would depend on Hill over the next 2 days, as Bull Run would see another major battle.